Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years. Pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. This week on the podcast, I have the person that I have dubbed in my head, yoga's lawyer, Cory Sterling. Cory is a lawyer who specializes in yoga professionals and yoga studios and has been around for years helping us draft our contracts, protect our assets, and on the whole, build better businesses. So this episode is a bridge episode between our mini-series on travel and tourism and our larger series that's happening this summer on yoga teacher training. So I asked Cory about both topics and we get into the nitty-gritty details. Cory talks about the importance of considering and protecting your relationships with other people and how a lawyer can help. But before we get into our chat with Cory, I have to tell you that I would really appreciate it if you liked, subscribed, or followed the podcast from wherever you're listening. If you love what you hear and you want to know more about what's going on in the yoga world, make sure that you sign up for our newsletter, and the link for that is in the show notes. And thank you, of course, to Sunlight Apothecary for sponsoring our podcast. Sunlight blends teas that fit in with any yoga class. Learn more at www.thesunlightexperience.com/apothecary. Now, let's talk about the law with yoga's lawyer, Cory Sterling. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, so this week on the podcast, I'm talking to an expert. I have Cory Sterling on the podcast with me. Cory, will you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Rebecca, what's up? And hi, everybody. I am a lawyer. I started a law firm called Conscious Counsel. We work with yoga teachers, yoga studios, yoga retreat organizers. I wrote a book called The Yoga Law Book, and I am super stoked to be here and share information today.
I am excited to have this conversation too, because partially I want to push us in a more professional path as an industry. So can I just quickly ask you, because I thought this, as I was thinking about our interview today, how the heck did you decide on yoga professionals? How did you get to us?
Well, I got to you because I am one of us.
Okay.
In the sense that all of this started when I was miserable working a corporate law job and spending all of my free time at yoga studios. And I didn't have a lot of free time at that moment. And then I was ready to quit being a lawyer because I was so disillusioned and it sucked so much. And at the time I was practicing yoga with a whole bunch of different teachers, and someone got injured in a class that we were doing outside of the studio. And I remember going up to the teacher afterwards and being like, hey, don't you realize that, you could totally get sued for a lot of money for this? And they had no idea. And then I was like, oh, maybe the yoga professionals don't know anything about the law. And then I was I would go, at the time, I would go to a lot of yoga festivals. I go to all the different Wanderlust festivals. And I just realized oh, none of the people in the yoga profession understand anything about the law. Or I would say very few, not none. And then I was like, cool, why don't I just give it a try? So I moved to India. I was living in an ashram, and I built an online legal practice to work specifically with yogis. And that was 7 years ago, and still going strong.
That's really actually fascinating. I love that story. And your name gets thrown around a lot in the yoga studio owner space. I don't know if you know that, but a lot of us recommend you amongst ourselves. And I think partially because one of the things that you've done well that I think we're all attempting to do that host businesses is this like interesting blend of our yoga ethics and practice versus like how it is to run a business and be professional, and in your case legally professional, like you're talking about the law. Do you find there's tension there amongst this idea of being like a good person and also running a business? Because I feel like we have that conversation a lot amongst ourselves.
I would replace the word tension with resistance.
Okay.
And I think a lot of it is, and I can say even myself, because I sort of am a yoga entrepreneur, even though I'm not
Yeah.
a yoga studio. I used to run a yoga festival in Canada. But I think the resistance is that it's part of self-identification. So a lot of what we think being a yoga professional means, it's not being capitalistic. It's not, oh, we're so driven by money and money's the reason for this. And oh, I want to keep it roots and I want to keep it heart led. And that's why like the slogan of my law firm is heart leading law, because what I've learned is that it's really, really important to have both. And I'll just speak from my personal example. Obviously, I'm a lawyer, so I'm ever always been set up properly legally. But just to use a different professional service with accounting, like I was not into accounting the first 4 years of my business. I was like, this doesn't matter. I don't care. Why would I pay someone to do this? All those sorts of things. And then, I wasn't doing things properly, and I paid a price, and that inspired and taught me the benefits of doing things properly from the start or as soon as possible, whether that's the present moment or whenever it is. And so what I'd say is I think the resistance is identification that, oh, if I'm a person who is getting all of my contracts in order, maybe people will think that I'm greedy or that I'm this or I'm too corporate. But what I've learned is if you want to exist in a particular environment, which is an environment of having a thriving business, ideally in financial abundance that allows you to live the life that you want and to build the community that you want to live, there are certain things that need to be done in order to set yourself up to succeed. And accounting is one of those things, and law is one of those things as well.
And you need an insurance agent.
And insurance as well.
So those three, like I tell everybody that all the time. Like, you need to love your accountant, you need to love your lawyer, you need to love your insurance agent. Like, and then you don't have to think about those things either, because somebody else who's got the professional expertise is helping you think about them already. Like, that's the best.
Rebecca, you've got it. And like my relationship with my accountant is we have a 30-minute meeting twice a year. And I don't know what he's doing. He's filing. He takes care of me. I trust him. He's super competent. He's got a lot of review. Like, I love him. But you're totally right. It's like if I were to divert my attention and my business towards accounting, A, I would be miserable, and B, I wouldn't be doing a good job. And my relationship in working with my clients, it's not that they're going to apply to go to law school. It's that I spend 30 minutes speaking to them twice a year, and they're fully protected and growing their business.
That is excellent. It's interesting. A lot of people like to throw lawyers around in this way. It's like a fear term, right? Like, oh my God, somebody's big enough to have a lawyer. And I was like, A, so not all lawyers know our industry, and B, not all lawyers are good lawyers. So I feel like finding a good lawyer is building a relationship. And I would bet that you would agree with that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And part of my mission, one of my personal missions is to transform the way legal services are provided for heart leading entrepreneurs. And so part of the transformation of that is getting people to change the way that they look at their lawyer, instead of being like, oh, it's my lawyer, like, oh, I'm so stressed. Instead of it's like, we're friends, like we're buddies. I would say I'm friends with almost all of my clients, and that whenever we have a work related thing to do, we're usually spending like 5 minutes talking about what we're grateful for, what we appreciate, or fun projects that we're working on. And even when I am helping clients through difficult situations, there's always an element of love and connection. And it's just like you said, love your lawyer. There are certain relationships that are really, really important for your business. And if you change the way that you think of your lawyer, where you're like, oh, this person can actually help me grow my business and protect my business and help me circumvent being bored and doing things I don't want to do, then like, yeah, you should definitely love that person.
And if you're listening to the podcast, you can't see me nodding my head emphatically, but like, really, I can't agree more with what you're saying here, Cory. Like, honestly, I would probably be talking to you if my uncle wasn't a lawyer, but
He's like, as you love your lawyer, that makes me happy. I'm going to go to sleep tonight.
So let's talk a little bit. This podcast is positioned coming off of a mini series of 5 episodes about travel and tourism in the yoga space. And we're going into a series on yoga teacher trainings. So I actually want to cover some law, legality kind of things on both of those cases. So let's start first with travel and tourism. You said you ran a festival. I've run a yoga conference before. I've taken people on retreat. What things do people have to be thinking about in those sorts of circumstances?
Perfect. The what you're always going to think about in any situation is the different relationships you have in the operation of your business. So, for example, when you're running a retreat, or let's say we'll stick with retreats. When you're running a retreat, you have different relationships. So if you're bringing along retreat facilitators, you have a relationship with them. If you have participants on the retreat, which I hope you do, you have a relationship with them. If you're renting a space from a venue, you have a relationship with them. Obviously, you're operating online and sharing about it and using photos and images, so you have a relationship online as well. And the goal for each relationship you have is to communicate expectations openly and honestly. So, cool, we're about to do this thing. What are you expecting from me? What am I expecting from you? Let's put that into a signed, executed legal document so that both of us memorialize exactly what it is that we want. Retreats are interesting because there are a lot of different variables that are at play. And a lot of the time, there's more of a startup cost or sunk costs that will be involved. But the key is realizing that when you work with a lawyer, your agreements should mirror one another, right? So typically on a retreat, you have to secure a spot at a venue and you have to pay a deposit by a certain date. And then on another date, you have to pay a certain percentage. And then at some date, you have to pay the full amount to the retreat host or the retreat venue to ensure that that everything's going to go smoothly and you've paid for all of it. You want your retreat participant agreements to mirror the relationship that you have with the venue, right? So, for example, when it's not like I'm randomly collecting payment from the participants, but I'm going to say there's a non-refundable deposit that you're going to have to pay in order to participate, and it has to be paid by this date. And then your first payment has to be on this date, and the full balance must be paid on this date. And you always want to have that a little bit ahead of the payments that you make to the venue so that you have time for the money to come into the bank account and then you can pay the venue so that ideally, as the retreat organizer, you're not paying anything out of pocket. And the entire retreat is covered. You know, those fixed costs are covered by the participants who are on the retreat. So generally speaking, there are a lot of things to consider, but in a very basic sense, you want all of the agreements that you have to be streamlined, and you want to make sure for each relationship that you're communicating expectations openly and honestly.
Ooh, that's really smart advice. That idea of, because you do, especially in a retreat sense, and true with a festival and conference too, but retreats are tricky because you're right, the expense to the facilitator is quite a lot. And so you're right, you want to be taking payments early and making sure your contracts reflect what your relationship is with the venue. That's really good advice because I think that we get it jumbled in our heads. Like people be like, oh my God, I'm going to do a payment plan that looks like a payment plan for teacher training, or a payment plan that's going to be like, you know, how I take membership payments at my studio. And these are different ways to think about how money flows and comes in. So I like that advice. Do you find that yoga people have a hard time conceptualizing like money flow in that way?
I don't think they have a tough time conceptualizing. I would say that they're inexperienced.
Okay.
So that's how I see it more, where it's like the same way I've just shared this tip with you. And the reason how I've been able to get this tip is because I've done this so many times with so many different clients. But it's just something that like you don't naturally think about the same way when you decide to become an entrepreneur, you don't naturally think about the law and the different relationships that you have. That's the whole point of working with experts on your team and you being in the center of the business, but having a resource center of different people who are really, really good at what they do at one specific thing, and you leverage their knowledge and information to help you grow your business. So definitely innately, like as we're born as human beings, there's nothing missing from yoga teachers that other people in other industries have. I think it's just experience and familiarity of relying on professional services the way other industries do.
So, do you think one of the things that we'll stay on retreats for a second? I think a lot of times yoga folks tend to, especially when we're amongst each other, we run on vibes a little bit versus contracts like the rest of, like a lot of other industries do. So, let's talk a little bit about you as a retreat facilitator deciding you want to take somebody with you so that you're not on call 24/7 the entire retreat, which a lot of people don't realize that when you take a retreat, your work, that is work the whole time, unless you have somebody else offsetting that workload. And people go, oh, well, somebody works for me for my studio, I'm going to just take them. And I'm like, I always cringe a little bit in my head. I'm like, no, that's a separate contract. Like,
yeah, it is a separate contract. And again, just coming back to the idea of communicating expectations. So I've seen this happen many, many times where someone brings along or a friend or a cousin or someone who works at the studio. And in their mind, they're like, oh, well, you're going to cook the food, or you're going to lead this class, or you're going to do that. But like included with cooking the food is like, how are the dishes getting done? And who's buying the food? And who's doing this? And in order to have as smooth of an operation as possible, you want to communicate all of these things as clearly as possible, essentially from the get-go. So, cool. Who's paying for airfare? Are you also going to be making sales? Are you getting a commission for the amount of sales that you bring in? How long are you staying? Who's paying for this? Are you allowed to drink and have your own free time?
Yeah.
Like I've just seen all of the issues. So just the catch-all is think about the ideal relationship that you want to have. And before you pay these people or start working with these people, put all of it into a document and just, hey, this is exactly what's happening. You pay your own airfare, we'll pay the accommodation and food. You're doing this. These are the expected hours. This is how you're expected to interact with guests, all that sort of stuff.
So let's talk a little bit about digital tagging too, because that's another thing that I think people often don't do. You walk into the studio, you see it like, an employee who's going to come with you, and you have a conversation face to face, and none of that is then put in writing. Do you recommend doing, so I always tell people to do this. You don't have to validate me, but this is just what I tell people is to so follow up that conversation with an email that says, hey, so as per our conversation, and you repeat what you said, so there's a clear documentation of what was discussed. Do you feel like that's overkill, or is it necessary?
I think it's a wonderful practice. So I totally applaud you for recommending it. And I think the next step is having a signed agreement, because it's all of the issues that I experience with my clients and the problems that I see them go through. If there was a signed agreement in place, none of those issues would be an issue.
Great.
So everything is based on what are the parties, the highest form of evidence or proof or support is a signed, executed agreement. After that, it's a lot of finger pointing and she said, or whatever it is. And also putting that in an email, it's very, very helpful, I think, for accountability in terms of, hey, this is what we agreed to. But if the other person doesn't reply to the email and say, yes, I understand, you're totally right, they could say, oh, I never got the email, or it didn't come through, or I never agreed to it, because if I did agree to it, I would have responded that I did. So the first look always is signed, executed agreement for the working relationships, but it's a really good tip and a reminder and something very practical to help people with.
So what other factors for, let's stay on retreats, and then I want to go to festivals and conferences, which are a whole other animal. Are there any other factors that we need to be considering, like our relationship with our clients that are coming with us on the retreat? Because that feels like a different kind of contract.
Yeah, that's called a retreat participant agreement. And so that sort of outlines like when payments are due, all those sort of things. It's also like expectations of behavior. And I see this on yoga. It's happened a number of times where I've had a client running a yoga teacher training or a yoga retreat where they wanted to kick someone out because they were always coming late, or they were drinking too much, or they were creating a problem, or they're making other people feel uncomfortable, or they were disrespectful to staff. So you want the agreement to cover everything about the relationship, but really it's the retreat waiver of liability that's super, super big. And the waiver of liability is someone basically saying, hey, I'm participating on this retreat, and we're going to do all these activities. And if I get hurt or suffer damages, I'm not going to hold you responsible for that. And I've had situations where clients have had people on their retreats who got injured and they weren't using a waiver of liability, which became a really, really, really big problem. And the general rule for waivers on retreats is it has to cover all of the activities that you do. So if you're swimming, if you're paddleboarding, if you're surfing, if you're hiking, if you're running, if you're doing goat yoga, whatever it is, you have to include everything in the waiver of liability, which is very different than like a yoga teacher training waiver of liability, which will be like, okay, hey, we're doing yoga classes and we're going to study and right? The materials are limited. With retreats, it opens a lot up, including international travel. So those are the main considerations to keep in mind.
Okay, let's slide into conferences and festivals next because that my insurance company I think had people sign 4 waivers by the time we were done because we came into a conference in early 2022 when the vaccine had just hit, so it was like crazy amount of COVID waivers. But tell me a little bit about factors that people need to think about if they're hosting a festival or a conference.
Okay, so let's if festival and conference, we can group it together. Again, the waiver of liability for the festival will be different. A lot of the time, you have people camping
Yeah.
and interaction outdoors, plus a whole variety of different activities like acro yoga or different types of workshops. So that's one thing. Still, you're going to want a conference or a festival participant agreement, which is also like rules around drugs and what happened, in alcohol use and expectation of behaviors, all that stuff that you'll attract at a festival. Specifically for festivals, you're always gonna want to have a volunteer agreement because festivals run on having volunteers assist support. So okay, hey, we're giving you a ticket. This is what you're doing for us. You get 3 shifts at 4 hours. This is what happens if you're not doing your shift. You have to pay the amount. Things related to that. For both conferences and festivals, you're going to have vendor agreements, which are a big source of revenue.
Yes.
So that's all of it's the same principle of, okay, when do you have to confirm payment by? Then you're making a deposit. These are the rules. This is what you can bring. I remember I had a big thing with a conference that they only wanted vegan vendors. And then one of the vendors was bringing animal products. They were like eating beef jerky. So
Oh.
yeah, but well, look, whatever I've experienced a lot. I've seen a lot of different things in this space, but media release is really, really important as well, especially because at conferences and festivals, so much of it is capturing photos, capturing
Yeah.
video, using that for the next year's sales. So off the top of my mind, remember, it's just the only game we're playing in law is just the relationship game. Who do you have a relationship with? And the goal is in that relationship to communicate expectations openly and honestly. And then what are the, legal implications of that unique relationship, which is obviously where a lawyer comes in and a lawyer with experience in the industry.
Yeah, the media release thing, I love that you brought that up because I think a lot of people don't think about that, especially like I am always on my teachers at my studio. Like we aren't taking pictures of people in their practice unless like that's just not what we do. That's not how I market my business anyway. So that's a whole other thing. But you can't just like post people's pictures up online without their consent if you're a business. And I think a lot of people look at social media and think that's what happens. And it probably does, but they should be hosting a release.
Yeah, you need it, and the biggest it's sloppy. All of these things, not having the documents in place at the end of the day puts risk on you financially and also puts an energetic risk on you as well. Where trust me, the one thing you don't want to do is spend a lot of money shooting and editing a video and then spending money in Facebook ads to promote it all over the place, only to have someone send you an email and say, hey, you've been using my image, video, or likeness to profit, and you didn't have my permission. I'm entitled to a share of the profits as a result. Like I've just been through it all. So the goal is not for clients to go to law school, but the goal is to be at best practices so that you don't have to deal with any of this nuisance.
What do you think is the thing that we miss the most? Like what are we not Like, what if you could tell yoga professionals, like, hey, so this is the one thing that I really want you to start with this?
The one thing is a document per relationship that you have.
Okay.
I wish I could just say, because look, I could say just waiver of liability, but so many of the issues I deal with aren't waiver of liability. So it's like
Yeah.
the one thing is just a package of documents. Hey, what are you up to? Where do you want to take your business? What are your goals? What relationships do you have? Cool. Let's figure this out in 5 days and go sell all of it. Sell it to everyone. Just sell it, grow your business, bring in revenue, have fun. If a problem comes up, forward me the email. You can continue selling the same day. Like the biggest issue I really see with clients is they don't invest properly at the start, like how I didn't with my accountant.
Yeah.
And then something happens, and then we're spending so much time and energy trying to fix a problem that they're completely diverted from selling. They're demotivated, they're upset, they're scared, and that doesn't work for anybody.
Yeah, that energetic thing I think is really great that you pointed that out, because it is like a big vacuum that will suck the energy out of you.
It is, and I see it. I see it with all of my clients, and it sucks, and it makes me sad. And it's in how many I can't tell you how many times. Like I wrote a book called the Yoga Law Book, and I wrote it years ago. And I remember my mindset was, cool. I'm going to capture all of the issues and all the problems that I see happening. So people are going to read this, and then they're not going to have to go through those problems themselves. And then today, like later today, I have a conversation talking about intellectual property ownership, and it just happens. It happens all the time. And what I've learned in a very personal sense is each professional is super passionate about what they do. And I'm probably way more passionate about the law than other people will. I'm like, that's why I know about it. That's what makes the world go round. And I think the important thing is to find trusted professionals that you can work with who have been through all of this and have seen all of the issues that come up, and just have them support you.
Oh my God, can we talk about this intellectual property situation for a second? Because I see that all the time in the yoga space. And honestly, I think yoga's not unique in that way. I think we oftentimes tell ourselves the story, oh, only in yoga, that's what happens. But if I'm being honest, I think that happens everywhere. People sort of copy and they'll take your ideas and things like that. So can we talk about that for a sec? What's your
Yeah.
like move?
What's your move? Okay. First thing, when it comes to intellectual property ownership, to keep it as simple as possible, your move is to have as much registered as possible, right?
Yes.
Because when you register or a trademark or copyright, when you have something that you've actually registered, now you've created a set of obvious legal rights around it. And if someone's copying you, it's so much easier to enforce those rights with something that's registered versus something that's not. So the first answer is register. Register your trademark. If you've created a teacher training manual, register the teacher training manual for copyright, get a copyright certificate number. Then when you're giving the students a copy of the intellectual property, part of all of my yoga teacher training agreements has a licensing, like an addendum that's a licensing agreement that's like, hey, these are my materials. You're paying me a certain amount of money. I'm going to let you review them and use them for personal use, but you're not allowed to use them to create your own teacher training, or you're not allowed to share them with any other person. So the really most basic step is register it. The first thing you should do is register it always.
Do you do that work? Do you help people register?
Totally. I don't do anything with patents. So
Yeah.
I don't touch any patent related work, but trademark registration, copyright registration is a very big part of my business. And really, when you ask me what's the one thing that yoga professionals, either in the retreat or festival or conference or teacher training space, should know about, my gut instinct is always to talk about trademarks, because trademarks are the goodwill of your business. They're the value of your business. They're the perception of your business. They're the reason why someone's going to choose you over choosing something else, because they've heard of you before, they've seen you before, they know about you, all those sorts of things. Obviously, the whole conversation we've had has been about agreements and communicating expectations and all of that. But really, when it comes to securing your intellectual property, there's no situation that makes me more upset than when a client has not properly secured their intellectual property and then they run into a problem because of it. And it's just unfortunate, and it's so preventable.
So, things that you might trademark. I mean, essentially, I love this podcast because it's just like therapy for me. So, we'll talk about me for a sec. Like,
Let's
okay,
talk
so
about you.
like, so I have a studio. You would trademark the name. Would you trademark the logo? Would you trademark, like, what for a studio owner would you trademark?
Yeah, a studio owner, the logo and the name of the studio would be is perfect. Because then you have to this is what happens, okay? When you register a trademark, it does two things. One is it means that you are allowed exclusive use of that particular mark. So if the
Yeah.
mark is the studio name or the logo, what it means is you now have the confidence that you're the only one who's allowed to use it. So you see another studio across the street or across the state or across the country that goes off using that, it creates confusion in the marketplace. You have
Yeah.
rights that you can exercise as a result. The second benefit is that by virtue of you registering it, no one else is allowed to register it. And the bigger issue that I run into with clients is that they did not register, but someone else did. And then they receive a cease and desist, and then they have an inferior legal position. And it's just one of those things where I'm always just like, why did you not just register this trademark? Like, I always do it same day with my clients. I've been through it so many times where it's like a seatbelt, it's like insurance, it's like something to know, okay, cool, I've spent all of my time to build this brand, but it's unprotected. Just like that's what you wake up in the morning, the first thing you should do is protect your intellectual property.
I think that a lot of people have this idea in their head that doing that's really expensive too, or it's for people who run really big companies and they're making a lot of money. Just dispel that myth for us.
Okay, the way that you have to think about it is think about all of the time and energy that you've spent on building this business. Put that into a box, okay? All you're paying your staff, you're paying rent, you're paying for everything that you pay, social media, for marketing, for your studio manager, everything that you're paying. Now imagine all of that could potentially be at risk by virtue of not investing $3,500. Like that's it. It's just you could lose the brand name. And I've had clients who are seven-figure businesses who it wasn't a question of if they had the money to or not. And I also have clients who just started and they never registered their intellectual property. And then one day in the mail, they get a cease and desist letter. And it's like, you have 14 days to change your website, change all of your marketing, change your logo, change it. All the t-shirts that I've invested, all the equipment, all of the signage outside my studio. It's like all of it is rooted in your ability to use that particular mark or words. And if you don't have that properly secured, then you're at risk of losing all of those things that are connected to it, which really, really sucks. And in addition to that, on the trademark front, oh, I had something so good that I wanted to say, and now I lost it.
That's okay. It'll come back because I think that bringing back to your point of like, ooh,
I remember.
There it is. Yes.
The other thing that's so important is some of us have the intention of building a business that we want to sell in the future. Like okay, cool. This is my baby, and I have a secondary project that I really want to do. So one day I'll sell my studio or my conference or my retreat or whatever it is. I have been part of acquisitions or deals for sales that they've come to a price, and then the next step after they have the price is doing something called due diligence to go through all of the different assets or the ownership of the business. And when you do not have a trademark registered for your business, the value of the goodwill of what someone's investing in is significantly lower. When you do have a trademark, it's significantly higher because it's sort of like buying a house that's built on a strong foundation versus building a house, that's on a hill and wobbly and shaky. I've even been part of a deal where there was they were selling the goodwill assets of the business. It was an asset purchase, and the person did not have a registered trademark. And not only did they not have, but someone else did have a registered trademark for that name. They never got the cease and desist, but it was out, so it was unregisterable, and they were at risk of it. And the value plummeted more than 40%, because at the end of the day, most of what people are buying is goodwill and your mailing list and your client base. And so if there's a risk that that's going to change for someone, they're not going to make the same investment. That's what I wanted to say.
This is like a mindset thing though too, because I think that when you look at like $3,500, like that's $3,500 you're investing in yourself and your ideas and your intellectual like it's investing in you. You're investing in what you believe you can build for the future. And I feel, do you feel like that's a mindset thing too? Because I can totally see people being like, but am I ever going to build anything that's worth that much money? Or, you know.
I'd say I've never heard one of my clients. I don't think I've ever heard one of my clients say, "Am I going to build something that's worth that amount?" So maybe I interact with my clients at a different stage in the journey,
Yeah.
than you do. I don't know, but I think mostly the resistance that I see is clients just think, they're like, "Whoa, that's really expensive, and I'm just
Yeah.
going to take my chances." And then like I said, and then like they love to spend money on social media. They love to spend money on branding and marketing. But
Yes.
cool, like I get that, and go off and do that, but make sure that what you're using is secure, because otherwise everything else is rooted in it. And yeah, and there's a possibility that it could all be at risk.
So the intellectual property, let's slide that into yoga teacher trainings, because like you said, people, we have to build manuals. And what you're going to do when you build your manuals, copyright it. Correct?
Correct.
What else are we thinking about in the teacher training space?
We're thinking about if we are creating the materials with anyone else. So the typical situation will be studio creates a yoga teacher training manual, and they have independent contractors, and the independent contractor has helped contribute some of the materials, and there was never a work for hire provision in the agreement. And that's what happened. So work for hire means I'm working with you, you're not an employee of mine, but the intention is that I'm going to own this property once we create it, and I'm paying you an amount to help prepare it, with the intention that I will be the exclusive owner. So without an agreement like that in place, the risk is that now the independent contractor, even an employee, if you're not in the main business of creating teacher certifications or manuals, an employee could argue that what I was doing was not in the scope of my normal employment. As such, I have ownership entitlements. And then at law, they're entitled to money, benefits,
Yeah.
profit every time you sell it. So let's say like your goal is to build a teacher training that you're going to grow over time. And you plan to, obviously, because I think everyone who does, I don't think anyone does it for one time. I think the idea is
Right.
that you do it to have it recurring revenue and a revenue stream. And the risk is that like you can, and I've seen this before, where someone hires, co-creates a manual, doesn't have the IP secured. That person goes away after the first or the second time. They run it 7, 8 times, and then that person comes back. It's like, oh, you've been using my intellectual property to make money. I'm entitled to 50% of all of the revenues that you've accumulated over the past 6 trainings. And that's not fun either.
Yeah, so that's a really good point too, because I do think that even, you know, I know not all studios host employees, I host employees, but like you're right, it's out of their typical scope of what we hired them for. If you hire somebody to be a yoga teacher, building a teacher training manual isn't part of that work. So that's a really good tip too, to make sure that those relationships have their own separate contract when you're having people come in to support your teacher training programs.
It's inevitable. You have to take care of it. You must.
So what are you doing for let's go again from trainer to client, trainer to student? Like what are you going to put in your student contract, say, and this has come up for me in the past. And I was very lucky, they were gracious, and it's now in my contract of like, let's say somebody pulls out at the last minute. What's your refund policy? Do you have time to pay them back? Do you have to pay them back in full? Like, do you suggest that your contract with the students cover all of those things?
Definitely, it has to. And the obvious ones are, okay, what, is there is there a non-refundable deposit included? How and when are payments made? What happens if someone wants to drop out in the middle?
Yep.
Is there a certain time frame from if people drop out, they're making the full payment? Are they allowed to switch it to another date in the future if they want? If they want someone to sub in for them or their position and basically find a replacement, those are all the things that you want to consider. The other things that always come up to me are just behavioral expectations around a teacher training. And especially if you're a studio, sometimes we see people participating on the assumption that they'll get hired by the studio. And so I've run into that problem with clients before, basically like having a no employment guarantee. The other things are just like behavior, showing up late, how you treat other people. I've had teacher trainings where people make rude and offensive comments, and affect the energy of the group
Yeah.
significantly. So those are sort of and the other thing is just like not stealing the materials for commercial use and making sure that they don't share with others. So usually with a teacher training, those are the things that come up. But again, usually the best teacher for what you want the agreements to have is what issues or problems have you experienced in the past, and then have an agreement that proactively deals with and addresses all those. So the benefit from my perspective and my team's perspective is we've done this so many times for so many people. It's like, as a yoga teacher trainer, you don't even know the problems that are going to happen. Yeah. I've already been through it 7 times. So we're constantly updating our documents to ensure that they proactively address these issues.
Okay. This is all like amazing advice. Let's talk a little bit about big picture industry things. Like, I want to talk about how the yoga profession exists, specifically in North America. We are a profession. We have one trade organization. Do we have the ability to like advocate for ourselves on a bigger level as an industry? Do you have like can we talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, what I can share, I don't know if I can answer, I don't know if I'll have a satisfying answer for you directly, but what I've seen last year, I was in Europe for 3 months working with a variety of different clients in yoga and Pilates. And then more recently, I was in Bali in Southeast Asia, speaking at teacher trainings, including my book and curriculum for teacher trainings, and leading workshops. And what I can say is the market in North America is both the most capitalistic and the most litigious, in the sense of like, I thought when I go to Bali, just because the sheer volume of yoga professionals that would be there, yeah, I would be like, wow, everyone's going to want agreements. And there it's like, it's way less developed as an industry than how it is in North America. And I had a really cool experience where I was at the Florida Yoga Expo giving a lecture on yoga law. And I literally came just from Bali. Like, I flew in from Bali the day before. And in Bali, it was so grassroots, undeveloped. No one's thinking about these issues. And then coming to this massive expo with all these different industries and, all these different offerings within the industry of retreats and teacher trainings and products and goods and services. So I think that I think that there's massive opportunity, and in my perspective, it's only growing and only getting bigger. Like, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if you're talking about unionization or specifically what it is that you were going for, but
I am 100% talking about that. I'm 100% talking about, I mean, because it becomes tricky, right? So in North America, we have a few of us are employees. Most of us are independent contractors. Those rights are different on employment law. And how we collectively can come together and advocate as an industry, because we have one organization, but they're not really in the job of advocating for us, right? They consider their role in the industry to be different than that.
Yeah, I think we're talking about Yoga Alliance. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
So Yoga Alliance, well, I don't have too much personal experience with them, but what they try to do is create formalized standard accreditation processes so that people, both teacher trainings and individuals, are paying them to be a part of their ecosystem. The issue of what you're talking about is regulation and
Yeah.
unification. And
Yeah.
I don't see it happening anytime soon. And all the conversations that I have or that I participate in, it's very, very rare that people have that there's a unified desire to see, some form of regulation around yoga. Also, because if you think of yoga, there's so many limbs and branches of what yoga really is that it would be very, very difficult to say this is the one yoga organization because
Yeah.
there's so many voices that would need to be heard. And, if you are they going to make a charter or a constitution? Who's going to do that? Yoga originates from India. So there would be it's sort of like when you're in a construction project you need permits to get started,
Yeah.
and then some people just start constructing and then like midway through you don't have permits but you're just in construction. I think yoga as an industry is more like that, where I don't think that when it came to the West that the anticipation was that health and wellness would develop in the trend that it has and that it
Yes.
is. And I think that retroactively it would be very, very difficult, and there would need to be some form of extremely significant event that would prompt a need for that, which I don't foresee that happening.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That construction analogy I think is really good. And I've said that a lot. Like when in the 90s, when the Yoga Alliance kind of formed, how could they possibly have anticipated Lululemon, for example, which, you know, blew us out of the water as far as like how much revenue was coming into the industry and things like who thought that we were going to be this way? So I understand how we got here, but I think a lot of us find frustration in the fact that there's nobody advocating for us as professionals.
We must advocate for ourselves as professionals. And even the example that you give of contractors versus employees, like if one understands the legal progress, when I started this 7 years ago, everyone in every state was an independent contractor. It was like almost nobody had any, and that's only 7 years, but
Yeah.
almost nobody had employees. Now, roughly half of the states in the United States have something called the ABC test, which means that if you are a yoga, and I'm going to make it specific to yoga, but the ABC test is if you are a yoga studio and your main service is providing yoga services, doesn't matter how many hours or how long someone works for you, they have to be an employee. That is a crazy change. I remember that in January 1, 2020, the state of California was the first state to adopt the AB5. It was called the AB5 test. And the state of California was the first one to follow. And then it was like Massachusetts was number 2. And then it was like 3. And then it's sort of like overnight, there's half the states are ABC states, which means that everyone at the studio technically should be an employee. Also, recently, the Department of Labor changed a ruling of what makes a contractor versus what makes an employee. So I don't think it's fair to say that there aren't changes happening and there aren't things advocating. I think it's the personal responsibility of each yoga professional, again, to work with people who understand the industry on a professional level from a context of professional services, and then participate in that way. I think it's an archaic approach to look at it and say, oh, well, there's no charter, so no one cares about us and no one's advocating. And I would say is these changes are happening, but it's happening in a different way that you're used to. And that if you're going to professionalize, you should work with people who understand the industry and what the changes in the industry are, because a lot of changes are happening. But whether or not we have an obligation to make ourselves aware of those changes instead of just having some uniform organization do everything for us.
That's a really interesting point because you're right. I don't think most of us are looking for the shift or the change to be happening legally speaking in like how we maintain employees versus contractors. But 7 years, that feels like a huge shift if half the states are legally required to hold employees versus contractors. That feels big.
That's also 4 years. That's 2020.
Oh, wow.
January 1, 2020 in California.
Wow. So, I mean, that actually feels like a good shift in like the professionalization process.
Totally. And also another example is the Biden administration passed some legislation. This was maybe a year ago or 2 years ago around non-compete provisions, basically making also that's another example of how things have changed. So, maybe one, if they were not paying attention to what's going on, and like, let's be real, who the hell knows about this or who the hell should know about this, right? Like
Yeah.
there's very few people who actually know what's going on, because what we're focused on is growing our studio and doing a training or going to Costa Rica or whatever it is that we're doing. But basically, one of the biggest issues in the past that plagued the industry, and especially independent teachers, was non-compete provisions where, oh, if I teach at this studio, it means that I'm not allowed to teach at this studio. But the reality is actually the laws have adapted and changed so that I won't put in a non-compete almost for any client, almost under any circumstances. And if I do, I'll advise them like, hey, just so you know, this is unenforceable and you could even be at risk by putting it in. And some people still want to put it in, and cool, that's their jam. The client can decide to put in something after I give it to them. But that's a really significant change. And that's something that really affected individuals in the industry, that these changes are happening, but it's not like there's not an Instagram viral TikTok video about non-competes. And most of the things we learn about through that medium. So yeah, maybe what yoga has to do is, as an industry, find different ways of bringing this information there, which is, I wrote my book and I sort of see in that way I've done my part, but there are a lot of things changing despite what it may look like.
I was just going to say, I need you to have like a monthly newsletter or even like a bi-yearly newsletter telling me what I missed.
It's an interesting idea. And what I would say is I would be so happy to do it if I felt that there was significant interest in it. Like if people really wanted to know some of the things going on, it could make sense to do it. But also like I wouldn't say I'm buried, but most of my time is spent putting out fires, just like putting out fires and yeah.
Okay, so speaking of fires, let's say somebody is listening and needs you to put out a fire. Cory, how do they get a hold of you and find your services?
Firstly, the first thing that you should do is, before there's a fire, get a fire extinguisher and put it in the house, which is that is getting your legal documents in order. So there's proactive law and there's reactive law. Proactive law is way more fun. Proactive law is, cool, this is my business. I understand that there's an investment. I'm set up, I'm going. Reactive law is, oh, I'll just borrow this template or copy this. And then a problem comes up and then there's a fire and then we have to put the fire out. So on Instagram, we're at Conscious Counsel. My name is Cory Sterling. Our firm website is consciouscounsel.ca. My book is called The Yoga Law Book, which can be bought on Amazon. And anyone who's listening, reach out if you want to chat about the industry, if you've got questions, if you need legal support, if you want to register a trademark, whatever it is, I'm here to help you be in a position to succeed. That's what I want more than anything else.
Okay, thank you so much for this conversation, Cory. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for this chat, Cory. I really enjoyed it. Here are our key takeaways. First, you don't need to choose between being a skillful business owner and having heart and soul in your business. In fact, the idea that we have to be one or the other, either skillful at business or have heart-led businesses, is one of those false parameters that we kind of make in our heads. We can do both. In fact, I think we should be. Next, thinking about all those different relationships that you have when you are hoping to engage in retreats or conferences is a great way to think about the legal issues that you might come up against. So as Cory said, think about the venue relationship, participant relationship, vendor relationships, and employee relationships. You want to communicate your expectations to all of the folks you are in relationship with openly and honestly. And that's probably good advice for interpersonal relationships too, but that might be another episode. Next, intellectual property ownership is a big conversation in our industry. Copyright your intellectual work, register your trademark, and take your business seriously enough to, at the very least, start a savings account to work towards getting your business registered. And finally, keeping up with the happenings in the industry is key to ethically and correctly operating your business. Figuring out who to follow, what to look for, and what trends to keep in mind, that's something that you can do with the help of resources like this podcast and other places like newsletters and trade publications. Up next in the podcast is, well, what we've all been waiting for, my 10-episode series on yoga teacher trainings. This series has been incredibly interesting to record for me, and there have been a surprising amount of hurdles to go through to get some of these conversations that I wanted to highlight. But I am excited to have you hear all the conversations that I had, and I will have some solo episodes in this series as well, just like I did on the series I did on perfectionism. I cannot wait to share my thoughts with you and for you all to hear what all these amazing folks said as well. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast, my friends, and I will catch you around the water cooler for some truly juicy chats next time.